Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Markwitt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
Today we're continuing our short series on careers and business. We've been talking in a few podcast episodes about, with your personality type and personal growth, and how do you look at personal growth and your personality type and you build a business or a career thinking about some of these things.
Yeah, well, and I don't think we've necessarily just come at it from the position of, what business should you be going into? Actually, we haven't talked about that at all. We've mostly been coming at it from the perspective of what is your relationship with money? What's your relationship with value and resource? What's your mentality around all of it?
Absolutely. Yeah, and we talked a lot in a previous podcast about your relationship with money and how you view it and the sophistication, the levels that you go through, the growth you might do, and using wealth creation and resource management as a personal growth tool. So you can actually literally use the creation of wealth, the creation of resource, maybe creating a business as a way to grow as a person, which is an interesting take on it because, some people think, well, if I grow, I could have a business. Well, what if you use the business to grow? Things like this. So these are some of the things we've been playing with. We've got some great feedback. And today we want to talk about a model that I learned, just a real basic model around money and business and careers that I learned a long time ago in my youth that has informed how I see most of what I do now, that I think would be very helpful for you listening, because it's just a very simple model that I picked up that has been very beneficial for me in my life and the businesses that I've started and the things that I've done. So this model comes from a book by Robert Kiyosaki. Now, Robert Kiyosaki wrote a book called Rich Dad, Poor Dad. It was part of the New York Times bestseller, I think in the mid-90s. I think it's still somewhat up on the business list of top books from that era. And even now, I think it still sells a lot. And he wrote a book called the Cashflow Quadrant as a follow-up to that book. And he's got a really interesting, simple 4-part model he teaches in the Cashflow Quadrant that I think is really spectacular for using in your financial view of the world, right? And the model basically goes like this. So if you would take a piece of paper out or visualize this in your mind if you're driving or you're on a treadmill, visualize, a quadrant, basically 4 boxes. So it looks similar to our car model that you'd draw out if you're looking at your personality type, but this is a totally different model. Draw out 4 boxes, and you've got your, top left quadrant, right, bottom, you basically have these 4 boxes. So he basically talks about how most people walk through different parts of this cash flow quadrant. In the top left box, I want you to write a big E up on that side. In the top right box, I want you to write a B as in boy. So E as in Edward, B as in boy. In the bottom left, write S as in Sam. And in the bottom right, write I as in Ivan. And if you're looking at this model and kind of visualizing it in your mind, the top left quadrant, that E, stands for employee. The bottom left quadrant, the S, stands for self-employed. The top right quadrant, B, stands for business. And the bottom right quadrant stands for investor. The I stands for investor or investments. And his theory is that we all start out, coming online as young people, we typically start out our lives in the top left part of this quadrant. So we end up getting a job. We're an employee at a company and we begin working for someone else. So we literally trade parts of our life, years and hours of our life, to a company or an employer who then compensates us based on giving up that time or that skill set to that employer, and they compensate us. They give us a paycheck every week or every month for the work we do for them. So that's kind of the first place most of us start in life, is we start with that. So I'm going to go ahead and just explain the whole model through, and then we can unpack it. So that's where we start. And then usually if you get sophisticated and you have the gumption and desire to move beyond just being an employee, oftentimes what people will do is they'll start some type of a service business, and they drop down into the bottom left quadrant, which is the self-employed quadrant. So you go from working for someone else to now working for yourself. So you have maybe You've been working for someone for a long time in a landscaping business. They've been employing you and you've been working hours. Starting maybe out of college, you got a job at a landscaping business. So you're helping landscape people's homes. And then you decide, I could do a landscaping business on my own. I probably could do this. I could get some clients and then I would be the boss of myself and I'd be able to do the work and not have to report to a boss. So I'm going to start my own business. You get a truck, you get some equipment, and you begin going around to people's houses without a boss. You're your own boss and you're doing landscaping business for them. So this is an example. You maybe start out like this. You end up being self-employed. A lot of self-employed professions are people that are maybe tax accountants that do a lot of freelance work. The business is you. You are the business. Your service, your product, whatever you offer is coming from you and it's your efforts that make it happen. So that's what we mean by self-employed. You are self-employed. You are your own boss and you're doing your, and it's typically a service industry. You're doing your service. You're doing something that you're getting compensated directly for. And so that's usually where people think like, wow, I've got my own business. Well, really, you don't have your own business at this level. You're just self-employed. So then what usually happens from this is you start to realize, man, let's just keep taking this metaphor of a landscaping business, outside of people's homes. You start to spread yourself so thin. Maybe it's just you and your spouse or you and your son or you and somebody else. Maybe you even have a partner, but it's still your own efforts making all of this happen. You're physically mowing people's lawns. You're physically digging and planting trees. And you think to yourself, what would happen if I could begin to hire people to do this and begin to outsource some of this work to employees and I become an employer myself? So now you graduate from being self-employed to owning your own business where you employ other people. So now maybe your efforts aren't so much on the, planting trees and mowing grass. Your efforts are on the contracts, selling the homeowner on maybe landscaping services or some of the marketing and sales, some of the bookkeeping. Now you're starting to scale up to a more of a leadership role and you're employing people that have the skills where they're mowing and they're digging holes for trees and planting things and all the hands-on piece. And it's this point where you cross over from being self-employed to being a business owner, that top right quadrant, to where now you are no longer tied directly to your efforts. Your compensation is no longer tied directly to your efforts. You now have a 1 degree of separation from how you get paid. It's not so much on I put an hour of work in and I make X number of dollars. It's now you might put an hour of work in and make 30 times back that because you're leveraging yourself through people that work for you or systems that you've set up, however your business looks. This is just a really basic example, a landscaping business example. And then if you do this for a while and you've got your own business, you have employees, now you start to know what it takes to run a business. You understand what goes into a successful business, how to hire, how to fire, how to get marketing and sales working for you, how to keep your finances, how to grow the business, how to expand. And you begin to see patterns of how that business works. And you say, you know what? I have money now that I'm making that I could invest in other businesses that I see that are up and coming businesses that if I just let the bank, if I just leave my money in the bank earning, a couple percentage interest, I'm not going to make a lot of money. But if I could take this money I'm earning for my business and I could invest it in other businesses, now I've gone up another level beyond just owning a business. Now I basically have pieces of multiple businesses I own. So now you've ratcheted up the scale one more level and you begin thinking like an investor. You begin investing your money in other people's businesses, not just your own at this point. So you can see where you start off. Most people have this progression. If you get to this level, you start off as an employee. You may end up being self-employed. Then you end up creating your own business. And then you end up investing in other people's businesses. And you can see a progression of how this works. For oftentimes when people get to that investor level, they've gone through these steps. So this is a really basic model that I've used since I learned it to think about business. And anytime I'm doing something, I always ask myself, which one of these quadrants am I in? And I've been in all 4 at this point in my life. And you can maybe ask yourself, which one of these quadrants am I in? Where am I at?
So depending upon which quadrant you're in, how does it change a person's relationship with money? Because we've been talking about before, understanding that money is really value exchange. So taking the models that we were referring to before, taking that mentality that money isn't just little pieces of paper, but actually it's value exchange. It's understanding how value is exchanged. How would you marry that mentality with the 4 quadrants, the cash, he calls it the cash flow quadrant, right? How would you overlay that on top of this? Like, what have you noticed are people's relationship with money as they progress to each quadrant?
Yeah. So great question. And one of the things that I would piggyback off that and say is that all of these levels are frames of mind, mindsets, basically. So you think in certain terms, and sometimes people can't get out of one and go into another because their mindset is so locked into that, it's difficult to move. So I think that one of the really basic ways to see how your mind is thinking about some of these is, and he actually talks about this in the book, when you're at the top left quadrant, the employee level is basically you have a job. Like you have a job that you work. And when you get to the self-employed level, you own a job. So you still kind of have a job, but you're more in ownership of it. You get to kind of call the shots a little bit more. You could say no to a client, whereas your boss would not allow you to do that. But you could say no if you own a job. And if you get to the business level, it's you own a system and people work for you. So you own a business, a system you've created, and people work for you. And when you get to the investor level, money begins to work for you. So you start seeing money as working for you. So you could look at the top left where you're at the employee level as I trade dollars or I trade hours for dollars. So that's kind of the mindset. It's like I trade, it's a one-to-one trade. I trade and I have to do what somebody tells me. I trade this. I trade what somebody tells me to trade, my time or my effort or my skill for a set amount of money. And then, so that mindset expands a little bit more to I get to trade what I want to trade at the self-employed levels. That's the employee level. The self-employed level is more, I get to trade what value I want to trade, what skill, what effort I want to do. I don't have to take on that client if I don't want for a set amount of money.
Well, and sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
No, please jump in. I want this to be a discussion.
The employee phase also is it's a contract between you and your employer about how much you're going to get, either salary or per hour, and that doesn't really go up unless you negotiate for a higher salary. But your performance isn't really tied. I mean, it is somewhat tied to that salary or that dollar per hour in the sense that you can always get fired. But it's not like if you put more work into something, you're going to get more pay.
Unless you're commission-based.
Unless you're commission-based,
exactly.
Right? Exactly. So when you're self-employed, then you see more of a direct correlation between your effort and the money that ends up going in the bank. So it really is more, you have more control over how much, how much effort versus how much monetary impact or value exchange. You have more control over the value exchange process.
Yeah. Well, it's much more direct, and you also, so you can see that your relationship is not with a boss. Your relationship is with your client.
Right.
If you're somebody that prepares taxes at the end of the year, you could work for an employer and you report to them. They just hand you the thing you've got to do every day. Here, work on this. If you're self-employed, you're facing directly. Your boss is your customer at that point. It's no longer a boss. It's your customer. Your employer is the person that's hiring you to do the task. So it's a much more direct relationship. You're exactly right. So you can kind of see how it feels good to have that direct relationship. Like I put this effort in, and it feels a little bit more like it's my effort that got this value back in the door, this money back in the door for my self-employed business that I have.
Right. And when you're self-employed, things can be scaled. You have a cap on scaling, which I'm sure is why you go to the next quadrant of being business owner. But it feels like as an employee, things aren't really scalable. Or you can't scale up. Like you pretty much have the cap of the pre-negotiated terms unless you're commission-based. But even then, there's going to be a cap. And so in order to, be able to scale up and to be able to, significantly alter your earnings, you have to graduate to self-employed.
Yeah. And what's really interesting about both being an employee and being self-employed is both of those positions in this model, and in most developed countries, those are the highest taxed positions to be in. So when you're at the employee level, you are paying the most taxes you will pay, as well as the self-employed level. Like you're going to pay a lot of taxes because you don't have a business to write off expenses in a way that a business owner does. Now, when you're self-employed, you can write off some of your expenses, but not in the same way that you have systems and you have a business with employees that you're running. You've got a lot more headaches at that level too, but you have a lot more tax advantages. And so you can see that people that create wealth shift from being an employee or self-employed. They shift into thinking about creating a systemic business that employs other people or systems. It doesn't have to necessarily be people. It could be technology that leverages your time. So it's no longer time specific. It's not about how much time you put into something. It's about how much value you create. So there's this big shift. So you're employed, then you become self-employed, and then there's a shift from time and effort into value creation, leveraged value creation when you flip into the business and investment side. So if you think of that quadrant on the left side, you're talking about very much a time for money situation. You're paying high taxes. You can only scale so far at the self-employed level. And once you begin to shift your mindset into, okay, I'm going to now build systems and business strategies that are going to leverage my time. So it's asynchronous now. I don't put in 1 hour for a set number of dollars. I might put in 1 hour that builds a product that sells again and again and again and again that I never have to touch ever again, or I have to maintenance very little. Now you're starting to think in terms of leveraged value creation. And that's really, you're starting to become a more sophisticated thinker about your career and about the way you develop and build business and money.
Right, and your ability to scale up now goes it's no longer, again, like you said, it's no longer an hour for dollar exchange. Like when you're self-employed even, you only have a limitation to how much you can do. And so you can charge more, but your product has to be commensurate with what you're charging. Otherwise, people will stop buying. So you have limitations there on what you can do scaling up wise. And if you're doing really great and people are buying your services like crazy, then, again, you're still just one person or maybe two people, and you can only do so much. The days of, or the hours of the day limit your ability to scale. Whereas if you are a business owner, like you said, now you've got a bunch of people working for you, and your limitation is only in how many people you can hire in order to, now you're trading their time for money in. And so the ability to scale goes huge. I mean, there's 5 employee businesses and there's 5,000, 25,000 employee businesses like Disney. Disney is 25,000 employees or something like that just in Orlando?
60,000.
Oh, 60,000.
Single-site employer in Orlando, yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's ridiculous. I always forget that. And every time you say it, I'm just always blown away. So 60,000 employees. So that's a business, right? And, Disney is only limited by how much talent that they can pull in order to employ, to fill new slots. So when you go from self-employed to business owner, that is a massive leap in scaling.
It's definitely a mindset shift at that point.
So now, what's the scaling difference that happens between business owner and investor?
Well, you're no longer looking at, when you become an investor, when you begin to invest in other businesses, either starting more businesses or investing in other businesses that have, that you have the opportunity to invest in, you're starting to see things. What you're actually doing is at the business level, when you've been hiring people and building technologies and systems to run a business. How I look at business and how I think other people that may not be wanting to do that business forever think of it as building things that could run without them, almost working yourself out of a job for us in a sense. Either you could sell the business as an asset in and of itself. And that's really a key, I think. When you start to get to the investor level, you stop seeing businesses as just businesses. You actually see them as complete and total entity and assets in and of themselves. They're self-contained systems.
Like a house you could sell.
Exactly. And so, this is a great example is real estate. People that purchase a house for, a certain amount of dollars, that maybe it's a fixer-upper, they invest time and effort and money into fixing it up, giving it new paint, restoring it, whatever, and then they sell it for a profit. Well, that's a very, very basic business system that's running. You bought something that was at a lower value, you increased the value of it, and you sold it for a higher amount value. So you bought it, you added value to this product or thing, this house or this property, and then you sold it for a higher amount. Why did you get paid the higher amount? It's because you took something of lower value and you increased it to higher value, and you got compensated for that value you added to that thing, that piece of property or that house. Think of businesses in the same way. When you get to the investor level, a lot of investors, there's a lot of different investment strategies. Obviously, there's the, people that day trade, they invest a lot to try to turn profits, or they trade currencies and things like this. What I'm talking about when I say investor, and what the cash flow quadrant is talking about, is that idea of seeing businesses as complete assets, is seeing something that you can add value to, or it's going to continue to increase in value, and you put your money into that because you can see it going to grow over a period of time. So you really shift your thinking. It's a very systemic way of thinking. It's a way of thinking that is very seeing things in complete and total encapsulated entities. So just like if you were going to buy, you already probably start thinking this way. Like if you're, somebody that thinks in terms of buying something, fixing it up, or reselling it, even if it's something simple, that's basically what investors are doing on a business level at the high end of what they're doing. And it may be millions of dollars they're dealing with. But this is what's going on. They're looking at increasing the value of that business. And sometimes that's just, they come in, I think it's a short-sighted strategy, but they might come in, they might buy the business or invest in the business, and they just fire a bunch of people to synthetically create higher profits to show that they've increased the value. Did they actually increase the value of the business? Did they just trim the fat? What are they actually doing there? But it's really thinking about value creation and how value is created and adding to something as an entity.
Well, and I know a lot of investors, not that I know a ton of investors, but I do know people who were extremely successful business owners, and it feels like they almost always graduate to being investors. Like I've seen that pattern happen over and over. So even before I learned the quadrants that we're talking about right now, I had observed that phenomenon happening. And the reason why this is so massively scalable, and by the way, this is how the wealthiest people in the world have, for the most part, generated their income. I think of, Charlie Munger and
his business partner, and it's escaping my mind as well.
Oh my gosh.
If you hadn't asked me.
Warren Buffett.
Warren Buffett, yeah. Like Charlie Munger.
Why could I remember Charlie Munger's name and not Warren Buffett? But this is how they are basically the wealthiest people, on the planet, or some of the wealthiest people on the planet, is because of they're investors. And the reason why this is so massively scalable is because you don't need any of your time. You just need your expertise. You just need your ability to initially be able to, almost like it's the business version of talent scouting. It's the business version of being able to see what is going to be a promising, viable business that will have high return on investment, and investing in it, giving it the money, and then letting it do its thing, and maybe coming in and maybe being an advisor, or going, hey, so what's going on, and checking in maybe quarterly, or just leaving it alone and letting people run it and just getting the return. Like, you don't really need a lot of your time. You just need your initial expertise and your investment up front. So your time is now no longer tied to this money. Whereas at the initial phases of this quadrant, you're, as an employee, it is a 1-to-1 ratio. Your time is directly tied to how much money you're getting. By the time you get to the end of it, your time isn't at all tied to how much you're getting. So I think that's why your relationship with time and money becomes more sophisticated as you go. It's really, that's why your perspective on money changes, because we have this idea that the most valuable asset we have to give is our time. And so we feel wrong if we're making money if our time is not directly tied to it. I know that I, as a business owner, have totally felt this way. Like I put all this time and energy into creating something, and then I sell it later, and like somebody buys it later, and I'll wake up the next morning and maybe a product of mine has sold like 5 or 6 copies. And for some reason, I have this really old programming from an earlier time period in my life that said I should have been working while those people were buying that, right? Even though I was working at one point. I worked a while back, and I put many hours into creating the program, but now it's evergreen, and now people can just purchase it, and they do. And for some reason, my brain goes, yeah, but it has to be a 1-to-1 ratio. It has to be 1 hour of time for however much money, I'm getting. And it really is a mind shift. It really is creating a different relationship with how money works for you, as opposed to going, I should have been actively working while this money was being made.
Yeah, so to encapsulate the shift that happens between the very first starting point in this quadrant, which is the employee level, and the ending point, which is the investor level, the shift that would happen is at the employee level, you are focused on time and money. And by the time you get to the investor level, you're focused on systems, processes, and value. So you swap time for systems and processes, and you swap money for value creation. And that's really how the mindset shifts at that point, is that you change from a time money standpoint to a systems and value creation standpoint. And this is how some of the wealthiest people on the planet think. They don't think in terms of money. They don't think in terms of like time for money. They think in terms of systems. And we've done a whole podcast on systems thinking, have we?
Yeah, we did.
Yeah, a whole podcast on systems thinking. So if you want to know what that's about, go listen to that. And they think about value creation, which we've talked about also on this short business series, because it's not about money, it's about value. And oftentimes CEOs and investors of a lot of investments and these business owners, they don't get paid much of a salary as an employee. Like I think someone like Steve Jobs, for example, the CEO of Apple, who basically built Apple from the ground and then saved it years later from going bankrupt, I think he made like $1 a year salary or something ridiculous like this, because he knew that true wealth is not in how much salary you draw, but it's in how you're thinking about the systems and businesses you're investing in and how you're creating value for those businesses and for the world in general. And so that's a major mindset shift. The other thing about this quadrant that's so exciting is that it is a progressional, it is a progressioned, sequenced model. So you start off somewhere and there's a roadmap of progression. And what's great about it is there's things you need to learn at each level. Like I've been at all the levels. I've learned a lot at the employee level. And if you're going to be a business owner someday with employees, you need to have the information of what is it like to be an employee, trading my time for dollars, for money. What is that like? And that's something you learn at the employee level. You understand what it's like to have to come into work at 9 o'clock in the morning and leave at 5 and have someone telling you what to do. And when you get to the business owner end of it, man, now you're going to have some of those things in the back of your head, like, I know what it's like to have to be employed. When you get to the self-employed level, you know what it's like to start dealing with clients. What do you do when a customer's upset? Your boss always handled that before. You just had to do the work he told you to do or she told you to do. Now the buck stops with you. You're the end point. When the customer's frustrated or they've got a question, you're the person that has to answer it. Your work is directly tied to that. So that's another whole level you learn something at. And then the business level, you learn about systems, you learn about employees, you learn about how to set up processes that'll run without you. That when you get to the investor level, you can look at businesses and say, I've built a business and I know how this is supposed to look. This is a big red flag for me to invest in this business. They don't have this system set up in a very good way. And you can make one of two choices at that level, like I could invest because they don't know what they're doing and help them build those systems. And that's one of the things I can contribute in value creation. Or I'm going to look somewhere else at another business that has a better system running because this is raising some red flags for me. You wouldn't know that as an investor had you not built a business for yourself. So there's all these things you learn at each of these levels as you progress that you keep adding onto as you go.
Yeah. I think what's so great about that is... And I'm thinking in terms of typology because I remember somebody just recently wrote in a question about being an INFJ and, how do you find the right job for yourself? And you can't, and this person was feeling like they couldn't really become self-employed or like they couldn't really start a business because it would be too much of a drain on them as for their personality type. And as we're going through, I could see there are certain personality types that are going to excel more than others instinctively in certain components of this. Like I could see some personality types being better at being self-employed than being business owners. And I could see some of them being better investors than being business owners. So for your personality type, you're probably going to run into one of these quadrants and go, ooh, this is not really super comfortable for me. But maybe one of the other quadrants as you scale up will become more natural to who you are. But I think there's lessons to be learned in all of them that even if that's not your cup of tea, like even if that's not your natural proclivity to be there, it's just like thinking of it as just a stage. Like I don't have to live here. I don't have to be here forever. I just have to pick up whatever lessons this will teach me so that I can graduate to the next phase, which might be more natural for me. And I like that component of it. I also like how as you scale, you can tell you've got to become more and more reliant on other people, not just yourself. When you're an employee, it's just about you being able to basically market yourself to a business and go, you should hire me and I'll work with a team or I'll work solo or whatever it is. But it's really just about you. When you up to self-employed, I don't know anybody who's self-employed that doesn't have at least like some things they're like at least contracting out, like somebody does their taxes for them or they've got a personal assistant or they've got somebody who's at least helping. So you've got to learn how to now work with somebody else. I know a lot of self-employed people who have partners, business partners. And then by the time you get to business, there's no way you can run a business without other people. So it forces you to also start scaling up and understanding that wealth generation is cooperative. Like, it's like, we got to do this together. I've got to learn how to work with other people. And that means that you see outside of just the limitations of your own personality type. You're not just going, I get a lot of questions from INFPs in the Myers-Briggs system about like, how could I ever be a business owner if I'm not really a systems thinker, right? If that systems are not my natural and I want to be more of an artist. Well, if that's the case, you got to go find somebody who's a systems thinker and you got to go, work with them. And as you mentioned, the higher up you go, the more it's about value as opposed to just money. Well, that other person who might be better at systems might not think in terms of making sure, that they're giving value, that they're staying in integrity with their product. And that's what you do, or you hold the vision for them so that you guys are, that you could do big things. You're holding that idealistic vision so that they, as a systems person, can now be working toward that vision. So we all have these really great components to our personality type that do very well to assist us in wealth generation and getting to the point where we want to be, as long as we understand it's going to have to be cooperative. You can't get to the investor level unless you have worked to or learned to work with lots of other people. And if you feel like you're having a hard time getting up to the next quadrant, whatever that is, then look for the person who will help you do that. Look for the personality type that will really help assist you to get to the next quadrant.
Yes. And those are great points, by the way. I think that I just want to sit with that for a moment because I think you brought up some really, really good points about learning how to work with other people, because it is true that we can't do anything in a vacuum. We are interdependent on other people in our lives. Now, this might not necessarily look like hiring employees. You might work with some freelancers that help you set up a basic online business, and that's fine. I mean, it doesn't have to be people that come into an office and you've got all this overhead and you've got to pay electric bills and all this. It might be a virtual type business where you work with freelancers all over the world that have different skill sets. So think creatively around this too. It doesn't have to be, your traditional mindset of what a business looks like. The other thing I just want to mention also is that, you might be very comfortable staying at one of these levels. You might just love being self-employed. It might give you the flexibility you need, and you don't really want to have the hassle of any kind of employees or systems you've got to create. You don't want to scale. And that, I think there needs to be room for people to say, I feel very comfortable being a solo, car mechanic, if that's inclined, or a solo graphic designer or whatever, self-employed. And that's totally fine. You don't have to scale up.
There are plenty of people who love being an employee.
Yeah, and they love being the employee. They get to not have any of the stress. I remember talking to a gentleman who was really good at what he did. He'd worked his way up in this like small mom and pop company. It was a construction company. And he was basically their foreman, the guy that ran everything. And I said, you are basically the guy that's doing all the work for this business. Why don't you just go start your own? You could make like 10 times as much money, and you're basically doing the same thing you'd be doing there anyway. He's like, no, I don't want all the hassle. I don't want to do the employees. I don't want to hire and fire. I just want to come into work every day. I want my weekends free. I don't have to think about it once I'm off the clock. And if I had my own business, I'd always have to be wondering what's happening. Is this contract going to go through? And all the stresses of that. He just loved being an employee. I thought, that's good for him. He doesn't seem to be minding it. He loves it. And that's right for him and his personality type. So that's something else to think about as well.
I think one of the things that I like about this quadrant, even though it's focused on wealth generation, is that I think we go through similar phases of development in quadrants when we're trying to make an impact in the world. And that's why we acknowledge, let's pretend that this was not cash flow, that this was game changing, right? That this is, you want to make an impact and actually, give something big, play a big game in the world. Some people don't want to do that. Like, they're just happy supporting their families and, just staying right there and doing what they can to support their family and, in a very much of an employee style. If you want to make a big impact, if you want to be a game changer, though, I do think our relationship has to change with how we're engaging with value in general, because impact is also value. It's not just wealth. It's also the value that we give back to the world. So I do believe that what's great about this, especially looking through the lens of personal development, is I think we go through similar quadrants when we are trying to make an impact in the world.
I want to address this idea of value a little bit. I think just in case you're listening and you're like, okay, I kind of get the idea of what you're talking about with value creation. I want to give a specific example to illustrate how this looks a little bit. One of the things that I'll use an example is what we do here at Personality Hacker. We create programs and products, trainings for the internet, and then we sell them. And so if we came with the standpoint that we need to get paid for our time, and we sat down to create a program, we'd want a certain dollar amount to create those programs. Oftentimes we'll sit down and spend weeks writing and creating and filming and editing and shooting and talking about and creating ancillary materials and bonuses and all of this, and we won't get paid a dime for our efforts in real time because we're understanding that we're creating something that's valuable that will eventually make money back for us. So we're creating an asset. We're creating something that is a valuable asset that can then be sold. Copies of that product or that training can be sold at a later date. And we really have to shift our mindset. We're basically doing a ton of work for free, in a sense, to create this product or this training. And we may not see a return on that for weeks or months until it's finished and we've created marketing around it, we've created a strategy to get the value back from that. And sometimes it doesn't work out so well. We've created a couple products that we believe they're really great, valuable products, but some of our audience hasn't been as interested in them. And we're like, oh, that's interesting. They're not interested in that. That's cool.
Well, and I've actually created products that in retrospect were terrible. And I spent weeks creating them and they ended up
been abandoned at this point.
And they've been abandoned. Yeah, exactly.
But we're thinking in terms of creating value. And if it doesn't work, we'll pull it and we'll create something that's more valuable because we're not trading our time to create these products and services and trainings for direct dollars. We're creating value in the world that we believe over time will be returned back to us. And we're not exactly sure how it will be yet. But our mindset is just to keep creating value. I mean, all of the articles we write on our blog and in this podcast, we don't get paid directly. In fact, we pay money for this podcast to host it, to record it. Our time, our effort, all goes into this. We're putting value out into the world ahead of time for the idea that someday value will be turned back to us. And it may not be even monetary value. It might be opportunity or people we meet or just having you listening, being a part of our community. I mean, that's valuable in and of itself. And so this is the level that we think your value exchange, this is what we're talking about when we talk about value exchange or value creation.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's when you're trying to make an impact in the world, it's important to remember that you got to get out of the employee mindset of dollar for time. When you get up to really wanting to do something big in the world, you have to do it based on what you're talking about, which is value exchange, and acknowledging that maybe you're not going to see that return for a while. Like it might be a while. Personality Hacker, I've been invested in Personality Hacker since 2009, basically. And we only really started seeing return in the last couple of years. And so there was a long time of being basically what I would call a starving artist. And I wouldn't call myself an employee during that time period. I would say that I was self-employed during that time period and did a lot of coaching. That was still a dollar for hour exchange, was doing a lot of coaching. But I think when you get to a point where you really want to create something of value, maybe even faith comes in there, that if you put something out in the world that's of high value, you'll be able to see that because the world will return it. It will reward it by returning it. And so when you want to provide value to the world, I think you have to get out of that employee mentality. I've seen so many businesses similar to ours that are like that they really want to create and generate value in the world. They've got big game plans, and they just have to, they have to anticipate that it's not going to be a dollar for time return, so they can't be banking on that. They've got to acknowledge that it's no longer an employee mentality. It's now self-employed, or actually more like a business mentality, where you recognize that you're setting up systems that will give you the return on investment. And sometimes the setting up of the system takes a while. It can take quite a bit of time investment initially, and you won't see any return. And yet, when you create a really good, viable system that provides a lot of value, you definitely see that get returned to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's important to think about in thinking about value creation, thinking about how you're going to move forward if you decide to take your career to more of the business end of things. What value are you going to create for the world? But there's an important piece of going through some of these levels and really learning things at each stage that you need to learn that I think all of us can benefit from as we go through these and we learn them. And where are you at right now? Where are you at in the Cashflow Quadrant. Are you at the employee level? Are you self-employed? Do you own your own business? Are you already a sophisticated investor? And do you have a stratification between some of these? How are you at in your journey? We want to hear from you, some of your feedback on this.
Yeah, and I'd love for people to maybe talk about what's coming up for them. Like, what do you think are some of the powerful lessons that you can, or mindset shifts that you're going to need in order to graduate to the next level? Because even if you end up, like, again, some people just like being an employee. And yet, if you want to return something big to the world, if you want to really become a better version of yourself and not just do a personal development journey for your own satisfaction, but also be able to give something back to the world, you could even stay an employee and do that. But how can you maybe apply this model to making an impact in the world and maybe seeing it not just an exchange of my time, but start building a system of giving value to the world, building a system, that will allow you to make a bigger impact and have a broader reach, as opposed to just, like, I am one person who's able to give another person some time, but that I can actually maybe scale that up and use time to my advantage and be able to make a bigger impact and impact more people's lives using that same 1 hour. So you don't even necessarily, I like using it in terms of wealth generation. I like thinking of it in terms of business and wealth creation, because I do believe that there is freedom that comes through wealth generation. And that said, even if you're a person who doesn't want to specifically apply it to money, you could also apply it to making an impact, because it is fundamentally value that we're talking about.
Let me just talk about one more example. I mentioned a graphic designer earlier, just to give you another illustration of this, because I think illustrations are very powerful. Let's say you're a graphic designer working for somebody right now. You've got an employer and they tell you what projects you're going to work on, and you decide you want to have your own practice. So now you hang out your quote unquote shingle online, you create a website, you've got some of your samples, you start to get clients, and you start to do self-employed work solo for different clients, maybe building websites and things like this. And then you decide, I want to leverage this, and I have enough clients right now that I could begin hiring some freelancers online, and you start to assemble a team. And now you've got other people working for you, so you can start taking on more clients. You can start taking on more graphic design projects. And then you're like, you know what? I think I want to start targeting certain businesses to be my graphic design clients. So now you start targeting maybe nonprofits that are doing something in the world that you have a passion for. Maybe you have a passion for animals, and so you start working with zoos or people that are helping to save endangered species. That's where you really want to focus in on, because that's a passion for you. So you can take your graphic design skills and your business now, you're able to start looking at clients and the people you're employing and start targeting businesses that really mean something to you. So now you're merging wealth creation and business training and learning through that with a mission that you are passionate about. And now you start seeing, okay, now I've done this, I've built this business up, maybe you've got your employees, and now you could take that to the next level and say, I want to start using the money I've made from this business, maybe investing in green technologies that are going to help save the planet, be more responsible. Maybe you want to invest in, because you're an animal lover, different types of businesses that are raising responsibly raised meat or something of this nature, depending on what your ethics and your morals are. But this is just a progression you can see, and you're still a graphic designer at that level. Like, that's still your talent, your skill set. But you can see how you've taken that skill and you've moved through those levels, and now you're also merging a mission. I think that's a great idea of not just thinking about this in wealth creation, but thinking about this in terms of making an impact in the world. And I've always said that affluence brings influence. So if you can create wealth, if you know how to build a business, the same tools that you learn to build a business, work with clients, hire employees, generate wealth, are often the same skills that are needed to make impact in the world. And so those are skills you learn there that you can apply toward anything once you learn them. It's fantastic. We were just talking about this today. You were mentioning the fact that it's not so much about the fact we build a business. If this business crashed and burned tomorrow, it's the things we learned to build this business. We think we could probably do it again in any other, another format, let's say. If Personality Hacker was gone tomorrow for some reason, we've learned a lot of skills that we believe we could apply toward other businesses. And so there's so much you learn here at these different levels. So that's just another example of how the progression could go through if you're listening for you specifically.
Yeah. So I think it's when we go through all of these models in your relationship with value, relationship with money, I think it's really important to remember that it's not just about I mean, it's okay if it's just about making money. That's okay too. I have no beef with that. I think it's just really important to remember that there's a lot folded within this that can be applied to so many ways to give back to the world and so many ways to become better versions of ourselves. So I think maybe because I was raised with this whole paradigm that, like anybody who wants to make a lot of money is a bad guy. Maybe that's why I continually remind myself and others that this is not necessarily like you just being a greedy bastard, but it's really about becoming, like you say all the time, the rising tide raises all ships. And it's really about becoming a better version, like rising the tide, doing what we can to understand these concepts on a sophisticated enough level so that when we're called upon to make choices, informed choices, maybe in politics or informed choices in the different, activist, movements that are important to us, when it comes to maybe just as a generation of people, moving and propelling forward some of these big institutions, that if we have a more sophisticated relationship with money and value, maybe as a society, we'll be making smarter choices. Maybe we'll be making better choices as people in general, because we're not just seeing ourselves on the receiving end of maybe being an employee or on the receiving end of, well, that's what can I do? I work for the man. I can't say damn the man because here I am. If we have more autonomy and a more balanced view of how all of this works, then we'll feel more empowered as people so that we'll make smarter choices financially, and also we'll be able to make smarter choices as a society because we don't just see ourselves on the receiving end of all of this, that we'll feel more in general empowered by our more sophisticated view of how all this works.
I firmly believe that we live in a time period where if you really want to go and create value and create business, you have a better opportunity now than ever before in the history of the world. There's more democratization of this. And so there's a lot of opportunity there. And whatever you choose to do, if you're creating value, I believe you'll be rewarded for it in some way. It'll come back to you from the universe. So what do you think? Does this model resonate with you? This Cashflow Quadrant model. The book, by the way, is a great book. I recommend it. It's got a lot more detail and more nuance to this model. This is a very broad brush overview, but it's a model that I've used in my life since I learned it, and I've really been thinking in these ways. And it really gives me a framework, and us a framework here at Personality Hacker, to view wealth creation and business and career movement through. It's a great lens, a great tool. So what do you think? I want to hear back from you. You can find us at personalityhacker.com. You can take the free online personality test there, give you some results on your personality, and then you can also get the premium results, one of our starter kits if you'd like to do that on that website. You can also come over to facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack. And I'm sure you're going to want to mention something about leaving a podcast feedback.
Do I do that every time?
But it's good. I think we should every time.
Yeah, well, I love the feedback that we get for iTunes, like our podcast feedback. And it doesn't even have to be good stuff. You can say whatever you want to as long as you're honest. But give us some feedback on iTunes about how much you like our podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Joel Markwitt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we can't wait to talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.